Dear YouTube viewers, I'm Vansworth Mackenzie. I want the viewers of YouTube to know that this video is part 2 of the video I've made before. That is called the so-called black race of people. They, the Gentile European people of Japheth, has been teaching us Hamite people to see ourselves as such, as this black race of people. Also, the Afro-American people and the so-called Latino and Hispanic people of their melting pot people of their conquest. Also the name as the Arab people and the so-called Middle Eastern people of their indoctrination for us Hamite people to see things their way according to what they want us to know from their point of view. As I mentioned before in one of my videos, that the name Arab came from Greek to the Roman as Arab people, which is speaking of these Ishmaelite people of Ishmael who are mixed up with the European man blood flowing through their veins, that they name as the Saudi Arabian people of the so-called Middle East, with their many captives who they had converted to their religious belief of Islam, to the worship of their God Allah, which this religious worship of theirs is of idolatry worship, because all worship belongs to Yahweh only, through the name of his son Yeshua, who did become the sacrificial lamb for the sin of the world, that through the sacrificial blood of Yeshua, those who believe and follow his teaching of the new covenant law that Yahweh did set up by way of Yeshua will be saved from the wrath of Yahweh that is to come upon this world of unbelievers and of un-Yahweh-like people. I also want to introduce to this video on YouTube an Asian map of the land of Ham that is known today as the so-called Africa and the so-called Middle East, of the conquest of the Greek and the Roman. This map became known as the tropical Africa, that was started from the Mediterranean area of the so-called Middle East to what is now known as Southwest Africa. This map was developed during the Portuguese with other European conquests of the land of Ham in 1648 AD. This map was taken from a book that is called A Political History of Tropical Africa, that was taken from the Groton Atlas of 1648, showing what they, the Gentile people of Europe, did call as tropical Africa. So my intention is to show to the people of Ham of today what the land of Ham did look like during those times of the European people conquest of the land of Ham to be their colonies of possession. This is a map I'm referring to that was started from the Mediterranean area to the so-called North Africa, all the way to what becomes known as South Africa. So again, this map is not known today because they have changed the world map from the way it was of ancient time. This map is not showing on the modern world map of today because they, the people of Europe, do not want the people of Ham to come to know about their true history of the land era of the people of Ham, of the Asian world that gone by, that they, the people of Europe, name as Africa and the so-called Middle East of the land of Canaan. As I did mention in one of my videos, that according to Genesis chapter 2, reading from verse 10 to verse 13, that the Garden of Eden, where the first human couple were living, where all the family of today came from, that became known today as East Africa, as it is so stated in Genesis chapter 2, that the first riverhead that came from out of the Garden of Eden did compass the complete land of Havilah, This land of Havilah was named after Cush's second son, who was known as Havilah. This land here of Havilah is known today as Nubia, because this name Nubia came from the conquest of the Ishmaelite Mohammedan Muslim people of what is known today as Saudi Arabian people of the so-called Middle East. This land area that is known today as the Saudi Arabian land was the land of Ramah, who was the fourth son of Cush. This information about the land of Ramah is according to Genesis chapter 10, reading from verse 7. This land area of what became known as Saudi Arabia was indeed the land of Ramah, as Genesis chapter 10 and also the scripture map of 1890 clearly show on the map. But a part of this land area of Ramah was given to Ishmael by his mother Hagar to settle on, because at the time of Hagar and Ishmael, they were all one family of the people of Ham, living very closely together as one people. So Ishmael's mother Hagar came from the land of Mizraim, that became known today as Egypt. But the name Egypt, it is a Greek name that was taken from the name Egyptos, spelled Aegyptos. This name Egyptos came about when Alexander the Great conquered the northern part of the land of Ham to the land of Canaan, that the Greek call as a part of this land area as Mesopotamia. That meant the land between two rivers, which is the Tigris and the Euphrates River. So this area of the Euphrates River is also the land of Canaan, that the various kingdom of Nimrod was located, that was called as the land of Shinar, which is also a part of the land of Canaan of ancient time. This land area of Nimrod became known today as the Persian Gulf. This land of Mizraim at the time of the conquest of Alexander the Great was under the rulership of the Persian. So Alexander the Great conquered from the so-called Middle East to Persia, that became known as Iran, to the land of Bharat, that became known today as the country of India. So the second riverhead that came from out of the Garden of Eden, that was called as Gihon, did compass the complete land of Seba. But the land of Seba became known today as the land of Ethiopia. But Seba was the first son of Cush, according to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7. So the name Ethiopia, it is a Greek and Latin name that was given to the land of Seba by way of conquest of the Greeks and the Romans, after the Romans defeated the Greeks and took over the land area of the Greek colonies. So my question to these Gentile people of Europe, who see themselves as the white race of the Gentile land that became known as Europe, from Greek mythology of the word Europa, who have been teaching us Hamite people who did came under their colonial slavery system, to see them as the white race of Europe, when it is clearly stated in Genesis chapter 2 verse 10 to verse 13 that the first river Ed and the second river did compass the complete land of Havilah and also the land of Seba that became known as Ethiopia. So what the scripture is telling us is that the Garden of Eden, where all the human family is coming from, is somewhere located in what become known today as East Africa. So as I did mention in one of my videos, that all the albino people of Europe came from out of the blood of the dark-skinned people who they name as African people and the so-called black people. So, as our Lord Yeshua mentioned in Matthew chapter 24, verse 11, that many false teachers shall arise and shall deceive many people. And this deceiving started from the Greek to the Roman Catholicism of the Roman Catholic Church, from where the name Christianity came from. This Christianity teaching was established by way of colonialism and slavery to get rich from their many captive people to believe in their doctrine, for their many captive to go by as a way of life. This is also true for the Mohammedan Muslim people of what become known as the Saudi Arabian people of Ishmael, who also had captured and enslaved many of their captives to become worshippers of their god Allah as a way of life for them to go by. As I had mentioned before, that this religious worship of theirs is of idolatry and paganism that they have captured many people to follow, which is nothing but idolatry worship. This is also true for the worship of Buddha that did become known as Buddhism, that many people of what become known as Asia worship this idol as their god, which is also of paganism. This is also true for what did become known as Hinduism, of the worship of their god, which is also of paganism and idolatry worship of these people of Bharat that did become known as India, by way of the Greek conquest and also that of the Romans, where the name India came from. The same is true for what become known as the Rastafarian religious worship of Selassie from the land of Seba of Jamaica, to which these people is of paganism and idolatry worship of their religious worship to a man, because all worship belongs to Yahweh only, through the name of his son Yeshua. I would like the viewers of YouTube to know that this word God with a capital G that stands for Yahweh, who is the creator and life giver of everything. So this word God was taken from the Canaanite word Elohim, but this word Elohim was taken from the worship of one of the Canaanite gods who was known as Baal, because the people of Canaan, with many other Hamite people of that time, had many gods who they used to worship and serve, because they had no knowledge of the true God Yahweh. This Canaanite word Adonai also was translated by the Greeks and the Romans that came down into the various languages of Europe as my Lord, which is speaking of Yahweh as my Lord. This word Adonai was translated down into the English and Saxon dialect that became known as the English language as my Lord, that was taken from the Canaanite Phoenician people language, because these titles of worship came from the Canaanite people to the worship of their gods. These titles of their worship came down into the Hebrew language of the people of Jacob, who became known as the children of Israel, because many of the children of Israel mothers came from the Canaanite women. So these names and titles also came down into the Hebrew language. Also, many of the children of Israel mothers came from the Babylonians, who they were dispersed among, for not sticking to the laws and commandments of Yahweh. This is also true for many of the children of Jacob mothers, because many of whom were of the people of Mizraim, who became known as Egyptian people, who they also came out of as a nation of people to go and take over the land of Canaan Yahweh gave to them. Because according to the scripture, it was 70 people of Israel who did leave from the land of Canaan to go into Egypt to settle there. This word Lord also applied to Yeshua as my Lord, and the angel as my Lord, because Yeshua and the angel are in a much higher authority and position than that of any man who is of the earth. So these Canaanite word and title came down into the Hebrew language as well as what become known as English or the Anglo-Saxon dialect that did become known as the English language of today. So as I did mention in one of my videos about the Gentile people of Japheth who see themselves as the white people of planet Earth. So this title of the word white race of the people of Europe was taken from the Latin word albus. This Latin word albus became known as albino or albino people into the English and Saxon dialect of the Germanic people that did become known as the English language of today. That gave birth to what the people of Europe call as the white race of people. So as I did mention in my said video about the Gentile people of Japheth, who see themselves as the white people of planet Earth. There in Leviticus chapter 13, starting from verse 13 to verse 17. There the scripture mentioned that the word white in a person's flesh means leprosy of raw flesh of diseases that do affect a person's body. I must also point out that there are no white raw flesh in a person's body of diseases of leprosy, but it is only red raw flesh of sore. But this translation of the people of Europe, because they see themselves as the white people of Europe. So this is the reason why it is expressed this way in the scripture. Because of their translation. The scripture went on to explain that if the leprosy cover all the skin of him who has the plague, from his head to his foot, wheresoever the priest shall look, then the priest shall consider, and behold, if the leprosy cover all the flesh, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. But if there is any raw flesh appear in this person who have the plague, then the priest shall see the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean, for the raw flesh is unclean, and it is leprosy. So as I did mention in my said video, that all the people who came from the word albino, which was taken from the Latin word albus, that came from the word leprosy. I must also point out that there are more dark-skinned people around the world, more than many of the people who see themselves as the white race of people. Although many of these dark-skinned people keep on washing out themselves into the European-looking people, because many of them are suffering from slavery and colonial mentality of wanting to run away from themselves because they have no knowledge of who they are and where they're coming from. Starting from what become known as Africa to the so-called Middle East, Asia, the West Indies, and many other places of the European people conquest of the world of colonialism and slavery to become rich people. This melting pot business, it is also because of the European tourist business to find pleasure and leisure, also to spread their corruption to the mind of many people of these places, because they have the tourist money power that a lot of people of these places look forward to as a way to make a living from the tourist business. I also want to point out that an albino couple can only bring about an albino child like themselves into this world. But no albino couple cannot bring any dark-skinned child into this world. But only a dark-skinned couple can bring about a dark-skinned child and also an albino child into this world, as the way Yahweh make things to be. and no man can change that. Many people of today do not know that the brown-skinned people came from the slavery experience of colonialism of the people of Europe with their various Hamite slave women who they had as their concubine. It has brought about many of their offspring people who were known as the mulatto people. This situation also came from many of the native women who the European men had as their concubine, because many of these off-breed people were known as the mulatto people, who were nearer in skin color to that of the people of Europe. Many of these mulatto and colored people were later given the name as the Hispanic and Latino people. But as I stated in one of my videos, that the real Latino people was that of the Romans, because that was the language they had spoken, as well as Greek, which this Latin language was taken from the Greek, Etruscan, and also from the Hittite people of Canaan, who used to have a city in the land of Ashkenaz that became known as the land of Turkey. This city of the Hittite people of Canaan in the Turkey era was known as Atoshia of the Anatolia era of Europe. The Phoenician Canaanite people also used to have control over what became known as Spain, and they also had a city in France that was known as Marseille, France. I must also point out that when Columbus went to what he named as the West Indies, because in the mind of Columbus, he thought he was west of the country of Bharat that did become known as the country of India by way of the Romans and the Greeks. So, the land of the Arawaks and the Carib people, with many other natives who did not get slaughtered off or were enslaved to death, were given the name as the Hispanic and Latino people. Many of these Hispanic and Latino people also came from the many Hamite slave women who were brought over to replace the Arawaks who were enslaved to death or were just slaughtered off by the Spanish, and was given the name as the Hispanic people of today. So many of these Hispanic and Latino people, as they're called, is more closer in skin complexion to that of the Gentile people of Europe. I also want to explain that when reading from volume 20 of the encyclopedia, they would explain that when Alexander the Great defeated the Persian, who was a ruler over what became known as North Africa, the so-called Middle East, and eastern part of Europe, then Alexander married off 10,000 of his soldiers to the local women of North Africa, the so-called Middle East, to Asia, to be their wife. By so doing, producing many brown-skinned people of the era. This is also true for the Romans when they defeated the Greek, who was the ruling power over North Africa and the so-called Middle East. Then many Roman generals used to seek out land in North Africa and the so-called Middle East to settle many of their retired soldiers on. By so doing, many of the retired soldiers breed up many women of the era, producing many brown-skinned people of the era. The same is true for the Turks, also for the Dutch, with many other European men of what become known as Southwest Africa. They breed up many of these tribal women of the era, producing many brown-skinned people who they had called as the colored people, with that of the European man blood flowing through their veins. So many of these mulatto and brown-skinned people of what become known as South Africa became known as the colored people of the era. I want to bring to many Hamite people mind of today, many of whom do not have any idea that it was a Canaanite tribe who were known as the Japhethites, who were the native of the city that is still known today as Jerusalem, that was named so during the time of the Japhethite people of Canaan, of their dwelling place. But unfortunately, many of these tribes, with many other Hamite tribes of the era of the land of Canaan, of the so-called Middle East, was destroyed by Yahweh on the behalf of the children of Jacob when they came from out of the land of Mizraim that became known as Egypt. I'm writing these things to benefit many Hamite people of today who do not have any knowledge of this true history that gone by, of yesterday, that has brought about many of our downfall of today, many of whom were the original native of what become known as the so-called Middle East. These Hamite natives of the so-called Middle East were the original people of the land era before Yahweh destroyed many of the various natives of the era and gave the land to Israel and to other Abrahamic seed. Abraham originally came from the country of Babylon, where he was born and raised until Yahweh told him to leave from Babylon to go where the Canaanite people were mostly living, so as to take over their lands. I must point out that Babylon was one of the city of Nimrod, who was the last son of Cush. I must say that Yahweh is not pleased with many of the doing of many Hamite people of the era with their idol worshippers and witchcraft worship that many of the Hamite people of the era were so involved with. So I do hope that many Hamite people of today may take a lesson of the destruction of the Canaanite people with that of many other Hamite people of the era who Yahweh destroyed because he was not pleased with many of their doings that's gone by, that was involved, like I said, with witchcraft, idolatry worship, and so on. Thank you, YouTube, for letting me bring out this video. I hope it may benefit to some of my people, may come to a better knowledge of what I've written about and what I put on YouTube, because as I said, it's not known. And many of my people today are living in total darkness and ignorance, and it's about time to wake up and come to the reality of truth and to move away from this colonial mentality of stupidity that these Europeans have set up for us, my people, to keep on going by and to see ourselves as such. Yes, it's about time. Thank you, YouTube. Take care.